Hi, Rosie, and hi, everyone. Welcome back to Many Minds Therapy Hub. How are you?
Hello. Hello, I'm excited to be here and have this conversation. Today,
Yeah.
we're going to talk about trauma and what is that, right? Like, I think that's it can be kind of a buzzword. And I think
Mm-hmm.
people can have a lot of opinions about is that valid? What is that actually trauma? And what does it mean?
Yeah. 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 And questions around whenever they may be giving a diagnosis or may say, "Hey, it seems like you have a trauma response," and how people sometimes take it,
Yeah.
not really understanding, can have some of those not so, yeah, I guess negative responses to it too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think too, like sometimes with diagnoses, there can be kind of an internalization of like what is wrong with me that I have this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or like perceiving it in some way that's kind of an internalized mental health stigma, right?
Yeah, that can actually be a block oftentimes to getting the support and the help people need.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I like to start, if that's okay with you. I have a little PowerPoint,
Yeah, that
and
sounds
that
great.
actually has a pretty good uh, definition right here. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So here's a definition of trauma that I really like. It's not one that comes from the diagnostic book. Um, but what is trauma? Like you said, comes from the Greek word for physical wound. So an event is traumatic if it is extremely upsetting, at least temporarily, overwhelms the individual's internal resources, and produces lasting psychological symptoms.
Yeah.
So, what do you just want to kind of just break this down a bit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that it can be when it talks about kind of internal an individual's internal resources,
Mhm.
I think oftentimes that's also our external resources. Like, what is our community? What is, like, what
Mhm.
is our relationship like with our families? If we feel like we have, a community of people that we can process these hard things with, then it
Right.
doesn't produce lasting symptoms, right? If we
Yeah. Yeah.
are, and I think EMDR talks about trauma as kind of being like this almost they talk about it as like undigested
Mhm.
memories essentially, right? Like your brain hasn't integrated these things, and I think a lot of the time that's because we're just trying to protect ourselves in all these
Yeah.
different ways, and sometimes that can block us from really kind of working through and making sense of what we went through.
Right, right. And I wonder if that also has to do with like even a few steps back, right? It's upsetting. And what is upsetting even mean to us? And what's upsetting even mean to other people? Like you're saying, how are we internally managing or noticing that this is an event that has extremely affected us as an individual? And how we manage that, but also how are the people around us being resources or being help or being supporting others, um, so that then we can, if we are not able to individually kind of work through some of those blocks or emotions that rise up, then are we getting the help from
Yeah.
others?
Yeah.
Or are we being blocked or minimized that the event was actually overwhelming? I think that that's really important.
Yeah, for sure. I think sometimes like this there can be kind of a sense of if I'm not getting through this gracefully or in a way that's not affecting me, then there can be again that internalized stigma, right? Of like, what is wrong with me that I can't handle this when
Mm-hmm.
you're just, a human and
Yeah.
you're only designed to be able to handle a certain amount. And if you don't have the community
Mm-hmm.
because you grew up in a family that taught you it was safe safest to try to be enough on your own, then it might not have been safe for you to learn to like need people, to learn to
Yeah.
lean on others. Or if you had messaging that made you not masculine or whatever, right? Like
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
good enough in some way.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, let me go to the next slide, because I think a lot of what you're speaking comes with,
Mhm.
like our own individual history in the world as
Yeah.
individuals, and, with those that are around us, and how then we learn to be with ourselves. There are
Yeah.
quite a few, variables, and we can touch on a few. Like our age matters, race matters, gender matters, socioeconomic status matters. So
Yeah.
that's more at the person level. So I'm
Mhm.
curious, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think what comes to mind around that
Hmm.
one is like this concept of allostatic load, right?
Hmm.
Which is how much marginalization am I experiencing kind of
Yeah.
in my life on a day-to-day way? One, right? Like
Hmm.
how much am I kind of monitoring unconsciously or consciously my safety in the world because of intersections of kind of marginalization or the ways that we might be
Yeah.
experiencing, you know, microaggressions or things that make us feel unsafe or unaccepted or rejected in
Hmm.
the world. And I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
too, like if our stress level is so high because we are just scrambling to try to make the rent payment, then
Hmm.
not, your central nervous system is already pretty maxed out at that point.
Right. Yeah. And we can think about that like in the short term, or like in a long constant,
Yeah.
day to day, years for years. What's coming up for me when you're saying that is countries that live in poverty, right? Or like
Yeah.
people, that live in poverty, and that's their constant day to day life. So now you have an overwhelmed system, meaning yourself, your body, without a break,
Right.
and how do you manage, to get out of that when you don't know if you're going to have a roof, you don't know if you're going to have food to eat, you don't know, how, if you have children, how you're going to care for them. So then your system is in a traumatic response on a day to day, day to day, day to day,
Yeah.
without really any break. And that's hard. That's hard on
Yeah.
people's psyche. Yeah.
Yeah. And it can be when you're in that kind of state where you're just barely holding everything together,
Hmm.
something that might to someone else not be a big deal might be that, straw that breaks the camel's back, right? You might get in a car accident that's not even that severe. And that can be
Hmm.
like the thing that breaks it all apart, that kind of makes the whole Jenga tower kind of fall apart, right? Essentially.
Hmm. Yeah. And that's kind of like, I think what's coming up for me is like, that's kind of those moments. And when, going back to the definition, from the Greek word, those are then those moments where you just really, whatever internal resources you had, you don't have anymore.
Right.
And then you are really, are you even trying to survive in those moments, or you're really just paralyzed? Because
Right.
now whatever little thing you had that was trying to make you through the day, those just collapsed.
Right.
And oftentimes people just end up feeling really just a sense of hopelessness and helplessness in the world.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. And I think too, if you think about it kind of as protective parts, right? If we have
Hmm.
parts of ourselves that kind of help us by avoiding,
Hmm.
right? For example, or kind of dissociating, then we're not able to process through the trauma. And that might be, we just don't have the resources. So there's this part of us that feels like if I really dive into this, then it's going to overwhelm me. And sometimes, like, when you're already kind of at that space where maybe avoidance might work
Hmm.
to some level in your day-to-day life, and then you go through something, traumatic loss of a parent or, whatever. And it's no longer, it's like the floodgates just kind of,
Yeah.
it no longer is
Yeah.
working.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that also can tie into the next point that we have here, and that is response to of others and the
Yeah.
context, right?
Mhm.
That's the reaction to the event or the person's response to the social and cultural system.
Yeah.
Now that we kind of like have limited, resources ourselves internally, and we are in, it could be in avoidance or kind of like just frozen. Do we have people? What is our history with relationships? What is our history with people? Are they showing up for us in those moments? Are they being the resources that we internally don't have?
Yeah.
And that's huge. Can they, even if they want it? Because sometimes people try or want to,
Mhm.
and context again matters. Maybe they are also in, if we have people that are also in trauma response because we're going through a traumatic event, can they even pull their own resources to show up for us?
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes it's like we might have kind of intergenerational maladaptive ways of coping that, like, maybe your family really loves you and really wants to show up for you, but
Mm-hmm.
the best way that they know how to get through hard things is to kind of try to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And when you're going through something traumatic and maybe that used to work for you, but suddenly it doesn't at all, to be told like you just need to get through this or whatever, like those kinds of things can, or you need to try harder or whatever, like that can feel so minimizing and isolating. And then it can kind of build on this internalized shame that you might be already experiencing of like, what's wrong with me that I can't
Right.
just pull myself up by my bootstraps.
Yeah, yeah.
And
What's wrong with me? Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I think too, like sometimes it's harder to find, like sometimes it can be when you have a marginalized identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
You might have community that also shares that identity that might be really like a strong resource for you. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
thinking, like queer, if you're queer and you have queer community that's really like helps and supports you, then that can be a really wonderful resource. But if you have a hard time, either you have kind of your own internalized stigma around that identity, whether that's like being a person of color or being fat,
Mm-hmm.
and like or kind of haven't found community that has that identity and embraces it, um then that can be also another barrier to finding the kind of community and cultural system that you kind of need to support you
Yeah, yeah.
through
To kind
stuff
of
like
minimize
that.
those lasting effects on, psychological effects. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think I'm thinking also of like, clearly I do have a lot of experience with poor communities
Mhm.
and marginalization when it comes to that. And I think the reason why some really thrive is because like you said, multi generations kind of come through maybe similar traumatic events in their lives. So it's like you're in a system that already suffering, and then they have learned that leaning on the neighbor, the
Mhm.
aunt, the uncle, the grandpa, whoever it is in your life, is the way to thrive and survive. Sorry, my voice is going away.
Yeah.
So, and I think those kind of are shields in a way to, or they minimize some of that
Yeah.
long-lasting psychological effects of the ongoing trauma that people are still experiencing, but they are protective in a way. There's a part of them that is being protected because they feel like they can be safe. If I need a bit of sugar or rice,
Mhm.
will my neighbor give it to me? Because that's all maybe my kid has to eat today.
Yeah.
And then kind of like just feeling that relief of I can actually lean on someone will reduce that. But then if you don't feel like you have those resources, again, that's what kind of, like you're saying, increases that sense of, isolation or shame that you're not able or good enough to push through.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that, I think that has to do also with the social and cultural system, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It makes me kind of think of like the individualism of a lot of America, right? Not every, obviously, there's a lot of diversity in America, and I think that's really beautiful,
Yeah.
but kind of the white supremacist values
Mm-hmm.
and like white American culture of like, you need to be enough on your own. This kind of individual
Mm-hmm.
doesn't serve anyone.
Yeah.
Not that there's, I don't know. I think that there's those kind of messaging, that kind of messaging that says like, if you are not functioning, if you're not thriving alone, then you're failing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's just, it sets people up to fail essentially, because we need people and we need community, and
Yeah.
in a more collectivist family um or country, right, then
Mm-hmm.
there is kind of this messaging that's different, that it's okay to need
Mm-hmm.
other people and that we all need each other.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, I mean, I think we're also kind of just touching a lot on the last one, that's the event or the stressor, and kind of like that interpersonal, um, relationships. But then also when it comes to just kind of to keep on this theme of what is trauma.
Yeah.
Um, again, we're touching on the frequency. Is it a short, one event, or is it long lasting? And like you're saying, are we being set up to fail, and we're like in this constant state of I'm failing, I'm failing, I'm failing, I'm failing, or is it one time events, there are quite a few, one car accident, one event of domestic violence, or is it multiple car accident or multiple ongoing events of domestic violence,
Right.
and that speak to, is it interpersonal or not interpersonal, which also kind of has an effect on how do we see people and how do we see ourselves in the
Mhm.
world. Are people safe or unsafe? Do we really lean on them if they kind of cost our own pain? um, that's a
Yeah.
big one, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I think too, like to take the example of a car accident, right? It, did this car, how severe was this car accident, right? Is this a car accident that, like left me with permanent chronic pain and a disability? Or is this a car accident that I walked away with minor or no physical injury? Am I going to be, the frequency, like how long am I going to be recovering from this? Can I ever
Mm-hmm.
fully? And also kind of the not interpersonal or non-interpersonal, where like, how are people, like that person that hit me, like how were they like, oh my God, how are you, I'm so sorry? Or
Mm-hmm.
were they like blaming me or trying to get out of it, or did they drive away?
Mm-hmm.
And kind of the predictability piece of like, do how much did I see it coming? Was I able to kind of adapt in the moment to the best of my ability? And also like, what is this recovery process going to look like? Do I even know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think, you know, it's hard because sometimes when people go through a car accident, and I've worked with clients that have gone through car accidents that really like sideline them and completely derailed things in their lives or their whole life, right? And versus, people that have like a minor accident and it's not a big
Mm-hmm.
deal. And I think when you compare yourself and you're like, well, or when other people say, like, why is this impacting you like this? I've had multiple car accidents and it wasn't a big
Mm-hmm.
deal, right? Like that can
Yeah.
be, and I think we'll touch on this a little bit in the next slide if I remember correctly, but like, how are people responding to us? Are people
Mm-hmm.
minimizing our experience? Are they kind of
Mm-hmm.
furthering that message that it's something's wrong with us, that we're having this.
Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, and I think you're bringing up some good points with car accidents, and I think this is important because we can, let's just say that we're like friends or family of someone who's going through a car accident, and it may have just been a simple car accident, but the person experienced that as a life-threatening event.
Right.
That's huge, like feeling overwhelmed, I'm going to die in the moment, I'll never see my family. Those kind of like thoughts in a split of a second will cause long-lasting psychological effects if we're not able to cope and manage with them. And on top of that, people are saying, hey, they just barely hit you, like, look at you, you're fine, get over, push through it. Like, why are you so anxious or depressed? Because their experience, so that's kind of like part of that minimization that happens, that doesn't support or help the recovery of someone who's gone through an overwhelming traumatic experience to them individually.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's a minimal, it's like you're saying, it's a minor accident, and we're simply talking about accidents, and we can walk through it. I've had small accidents, and I've worked through it. I've had an accident where someone literally just like hit me through the side passenger. It was very disturbing to me. So I think it depends how we are experiencing those events ourselves.
Yeah. What was it like in the moment?
Mm-hmm.
Did people, come to my aid, right? Like all of these things,
Mm-hmm.
people rush in and they're showing like they
Mm-hmm.
really care, even though they're strangers, right? That's such a different
Mm-hmm.
experience than
Mm-hmm.
left on the side of the freeway or whatever while the person drives off. And I think, how am I
Yeah.
experiencing it in the moment? Like you said, did I fear for my life, right? Like,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 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 Let me see what you were talking about.
oh, I think it's a little further, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, these are just kind of like the individual variables of
Yeah.
all of us, and they do really play. We don't want to go too deep into this one because I feel like we've been talking about it
Right.
generally, but they really play into how we experience trauma. And these are kind of like those things that are there before the traumatic events. Your gender, your age, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
And we talked a little about, do people in our life have their own resources to show up for us?
Yeah.
If they are marginalized, but they've learned how to thrive in the system where they're being marginalized, and they'll show up, but they haven't, maybe even if they wanted to, they couldn't really give us the support that they wanted.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. You talked a little bit about family already.
Yeah. I think we
Mhm,
did hit a lot on
mhm,
several of these kind of things, but I think, yeah, like I think another factor that kind of stands out
mhm.
in this is like mental disorders. Like, are we already kind of in a state where we're depressed? Are we already,
Yeah.
struggling with generalized anxiety, or,
Mhm.
do we
Yeah.
already have past trauma that, maybe we have PTSD, or we might have
Mhm.
kind of this like hyperreactive nervous system that like just kind of unconsciously walking through the world on edge,
Right.
right?
And that just creates more of that complex trauma that we may not get to today. We may need to
Yeah,
do
maybe
another day.
maybe
Yeah.
another session.
I think from this one though, like the less functional coping styles, and you did talk about a bit of more of like that avoidant
Yeah.
strategies that sometimes we use. And I oftentimes tell people when I work with trauma, and it's okay if this is how you learn to survive in the world, but it's helping you. And
Mhm.
whatever happened to you today, you may set it aside, but it's going to show up somehow, somewhere, today, tomorrow, in 10 years. So, um, you know, do we want to look at it and see if, since this is something you want to work through, because it may not help you in the
Yeah.
long run. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think too, like, did we did we grow up in a family where there was kind of this conversation around emotions where we taught how
Yeah.
to feel and process them even,
Mm-hmm.
or were we in a family that tried to avoid them, or were our
Yeah.
parents, lovingly trying to protect us from emotions
Mm-hmm.
that they were feeling about something that the family was going through, when maybe it would have been more helpful to go through it together, to process it together, to talk about it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. And then that modeling kind of is passed down
Yeah. Yeah. When you're
to
given this
us.
space to kind of fall apart and shown that you're still fine, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
you still have a container there, then it's easier to let yourself kind of lean into scary emotions when you're not sure where the bottom of that is, right? If I
Yeah. But that's the key right there, right? You have a container, you can fall apart within a container. Like
right.
that means you have the resources that people, or you don't. Because, they, like you said, lovingly try to protect you so much that now you don't have that container to process. So then you're trying to manage on your own and learn from them that this is the way to do it.
Yeah.
So there is no container.
Yeah. Or like when I think about my own family, like my parents are therapists and they talked a lot about like
Mm-hmm.
emotional regulation skills and emotional identification and these kinds of things, right? Like I knew how to
Mm-hmm.
tell what I was feeling, but they were also trying to protect me and my sister from the grief that they had from losing their first child. And
Mm-hmm.
so there wasn't a lot of modeling around really like being with their feelings because it was such a big
Mm-hmm.
thing that they were just trying to not feel. So maybe they might tell you intellectually. I knew how to intellectualize my feelings wonderfully. I did not know how to sink into them, how to be with them,
Yeah.
not run from them. It took time.
Yeah. Yeah. That's how you learn how to do it. I was the opposite. I used to cry all the time.
Mm.
I had to learn how to not cry for anything. I think it's really interesting. I'm laughing, but it's really interesting how this is actually a perfect example of sometimes it is safe, but it can get to a point where you're like really just dysregulating because you're crying
Mhm.
so much for emotions are good. That's clearly they didn't say that to me, but I saw that they would cry, they would get upset, they would be
Mhm.
happy again. So then I did that all the time, and it's not always welcomed, right? So I
Mhm.
think that also creates this for people where that in itself can be a bit disturbing, right? I had a place where, I could cry, but then I stepped out of that context and people have different experiences. And then they learn to maybe, okay, I have to dial back. And is it really safe for me to share, and lean on to this community?
Mhm.
I don't know
Yeah.
if that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think it can be such a hard thing to kind of navigate who and when and in what context is it safe for me to feel. And
Mm-hmm.
right, like, is this person actually safe to lean on? I think a lot of the time these
Right.
kind of protective parts we develop
Mm-hmm.
that are kind of scanning, it's like there's wisdom in that, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's smart that our system kind of develops these ways of looking at like, is this person really safe? Do they actually want to hear what I'm actually feeling? Right? Is this
Right, right. But when you add on top
actually
of
a
that
safe
a traumatic, yeah, when you
place?
add on top of that a traumatic event, then I feel like that's magnified, right?
Yeah.
And oftentimes that's when people don't necessarily, they go on to developing maybe different coping strategies
Mhm.
because now they've learned that maybe it's not always safe in the world. And I like to actually validate that for people, um, because it is a fact. Sometimes it's not really safe to lean on to some people,
Yeah.
um, but I also, do encourage people, where do you find the resources? Is there anyone in your life that you can actually lean on? So you're not sitting through, you're not carrying in your body all of this, reaction from a traumatic event.
Right.
Because otherwise, it shows up, pain, stomachache, headaches, nightmares, and you just carry those with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think discernment is important, being able to discern, is this person actually a safe container for me?
Yeah.
Do they care? Right. And do they care in the way that I need them to care?
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, you just gave the perfect example about how you did that yourself, right? Your parents had like loving intentions.
Yeah.
They didn't want anything but to like care for you, and then the strategies were not helping you always. But then you learn how to do that. That's what I heard.
Yeah. Yeah. For
When
sure.
safe.
Yeah. It definitely took me some time and therapy and all the things. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that I brought up before, I think in a previous episode, this quote or this interview or whatever. I don't know the exact quote, but this interview I saw with Gabor Mate, right? That
Yeah.
can you raise
I'm
a
gonna.
child without trauma? And then his
Mm-hmm.
response was like, if you're asking if you can raise a child without hard events, then the answer is no. But if you're
Right.
asking, like, that's not what trauma is, it's like going through it alone, right? Like,
Yeah.
do I have people that I can process what I'm experiencing with? Yeah.
And I think that's the key. Like community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or at least the one person that you can lean on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. This is great conversation, Rosie.
Yeah. Thank you, Yamilka. It was lovely.
Yeah. And I'm sorry we don't have more time. Maybe we do need to continue later on.
Yeah. Maybe we can talk about complex trauma in in a future episode. I think there's a lot to unpack around trauma. It's such a rich topic. What happens in the brain? What happens when we experience it over long periods of time? How do I know, like, what are the symptoms even of traumatic? Like, what is a trauma symptom? There's a lot in that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'll see everyone at another episode. Thanks again.
Bye.